So, okay, okay, yeah. Good evening from Indonesia to all participants in here, and yeah, good morning in the US, yeah, to Professor Mark Beissinger. Today we have a book discussion with Professor Mark Beissinger. I'm Nunu. I'm a lecturer at Department of Political Science, Universitas Airlangga, Indonesia, and I also will be a moderator. And we would like to thank you to the Development Study Club that organized for today's book discussion. Okay. So before we get into today's book discussion, we'll introduce Professor Mark Beissinger in the short profile. Yeah. Professor Mark Beissinger is the Henry W. Putnam Professor in the Department of Politics at Princeton University. Yeah, so, and he previously served on the faculties of University of Wisconsin Madison and Harvard University. So his main fields of interest are social movements, revolutions, nationalism, state building, and imperialism, which particular emphasize on the Soviet Union and the post-Soviet states. So for all the participants in here, if you have a big interest about revolutions or social movement, mainly in the Soviet Union and the post-Soviet states, so it's your opportunity to ask question or deliver comments. So yeah. So for all the participants, yeah, who want to ask and respond, you can use a raise hand feature and write them down on the chat box. Okay, Professor Mark Beissinger, the time is yours.
Well, thank you. Let me share my screen here. Let's see if I have a PowerPoint presentation. There we go. Okay, you can all see that, I assume. So let me thank you all for this invitation to talk to you here today about social movements and revolutions, and in particular, I'm going to talk a little bit about my new book, The Revolutionary City. So I don't need to tell you that Surabaya is a city with rich revolutionary history, both in Indonesia's struggle for independence as well as in the overthrow of Suharto. So it's particularly appropriate, perhaps, that I'm going to talk about revolutions here today with you. So, and this is my first time in Indonesia, even if I'm with you only virtually. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but I was asked basically to summarize the main arguments of my new book. So I'll talk for maybe about 40 minutes, and then we can open up the floor to discussion about anything about revolutions, social movements, or any topics you want to talk about. So my new book, The Revolutionary City, examines the evolution of political revolutions around the world over more than a century. And probably the most contentious issue in the study of revolutions is the definition of revolution itself, ironically. So I define a revolution as a mass siege of an established government by its own population with the goals of displacing the incumbent regime and substantially altering the political or social order. There are two goals in all revolutions. One is to change the government, and the other is to bring about substantive political or social change after that occurs. And this definition fits the way in which revolution is generally talked about today within political science and sociology. It accords with the definition that Trotsky gave that I've given you here on this slide, as well as with many other definitions by scholars. So I treat revolution as a mode of regime change from below, one that differs from coups d'etats or foreign invasions that are aimed at regime change. In a revolution, a government is laid siege to not by its own military or by a foreign army, but rather by its own civilian population. And I'm sure that one of the questions that you probably have is, how does a social movement differ from a revolution? And actually, revolutions often evolve out of social movements. But social movements generally don't aim at regime change. Rather, they seek reforms within an existing regime. Now, at times, they do engage in a siege of government in order to attain those changes, but they do many other things also. But when they do engage in a siege of government and also aim at overthrowing the government, then they become revolutionary. And many revolutions actually start as social movements and become revolutionary. So there's a vast literature on revolutions, and I'm not going to review that here, but within that literature, my new work is distinct in a number of ways. First of all, it's about revolutions around the world. It has a global scope. It also focuses on the city as a spatial site for revolution, as you'll see in a minute. It also focuses on all three aspects of revolution. That is, not only the revolutionary process and the emergence of revolutions, but also the outcomes of revolutions, that is, whether a revolutionary movement succeeds, but also the consequences of revolution and what happens after revolution. It has a multidisciplinary and multi-method approach, and it brings to bear a number of new sources of information on the study of revolution that we really haven't had in the past. So, for one thing, I put together a data set of 345 revolutionary episodes around the world from 1900 to 2014. There are really no other comparable records of revolution around the world. But I would say that kind of information is really needed for identifying global trends and the factors associated with them, as well as for placing individual revolutions within some kind of comparative perspective. All of that data, all of that information is on my website. You're welcome to download it and to use it. It's publicly available at this point in time. So the book also uses a series of unusual public opinion surveys, probing individual level participation in 4 revolutions: the 2004 Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the 2010 Tunisian Revolution, the 2011 Egyptian Revolution, and the 2013 Euromaidan Revolution in Ukraine. So these revolutions represent examples of the new urban revolutionary repertoire that I talk about a lot in the book. It plays a central role in the book. And these are the types of revolutions that have become more common in recent decades. Now, these public opinion surveys are very, very rare. It's unusual to have a detailed, systematic record of the attitudes, behaviors, and backgrounds of the people who participate in a revolution. Most of what we know about who participates in a revolution comes from lists of people who were arrested or lists of people who were killed. That information is usually quite thin. Maybe it contains the year they were born and their occupation and so on. But these surveys that I have utilized in the book, they contain a lot of detail. They tell us whether somebody went to the gym last week or whether they saw a lawyer in the last month. They tell us about their political attitudes and the languages they speak at home and so on, their religious attitudes and behaviors. And so they allow us to analyze also participants across multiple revolutions and to compare them with other members of society, which makes them really unique records in the study of revolution. Again, this data is on my website. You're welcome to download it and to look at it. Finally, the book uses extensive case materials from numerous revolutions around the world. I won't be able to talk about the details of that today too much, but we may talk about that in discussion. It tries to drill down to the events and interactions that occur within revolutions, as well as the spaces within which revolutions unfold. So the revolutionary city is essentially about the how the concentration of people, power, and wealth in cities has affected the incidence, practice, and consequences of revolutions around the world. And as you know very well, in Indonesia, the scale of urbanization over the past century has been nothing less than spectacular. In 1900, 13% of the world's population was urban, and only 13 cities, most of them in Europe, had more than 1 million inhabitants. By 2014, 54% of the world's population was urban, and 548 cities around the world had more than 1 million inhabitants. Now, this transformation, this urban transformation in Indonesia in particular, has been no less astounding. So in 1950, as you probably know, 15% of the Indonesian population lived in urban areas, with only Jakarta having more than 1 million inhabitants. Today, more than 57% of Indonesian society lives in cities, with 15 Indonesian cities having more than 1 million inhabitants. And Indonesia is, of course, home to the second largest urban agglomeration in the world, centering around Jakarta with 35 million people, which is second only to Tokyo. So you are very much a part of this urban transformation that has overtaken the world. Now, as the book argues, this transformation has had some very profound effects on the ways in which people go about challenging their governments from below. And one effect has been the decline of what scholars call social revolution. So social revolutions are revolutions that aim at transforming a society's class structures through mass-based revolt from below. And in the scholarly literature, social revolutions have been the most theorized form of revolution. Most of the literature that we have on revolutions, much of it is about social revolutions. And it's generally accepted that social revolutions were not only rooted in the Cold War, but also in what sociologist Theda Skocpol called agrarian bureaucratic society. Agrarian bureaucratic society. So in Skocpol's formulation, agrarian bureaucratic society was a social formation in which control over and extraction of resources from peasants depended on a coordination between a semi-bureaucratic state and a landed upper class. So this relationship between a landed upper class and peasants is central to many of the theories that we have about social revolutions and the conditions under which they emerged. For instance, there's a very strong statistical relationship between the outbreak of social revolutions and land inequality. Land inequality is central, has been a central issue in most social revolutions. However, as I describe in the book, by the late 20th century, this agrarian bureaucratic world had largely begun to fade. It began to fade under the impact of urbanization, under the impact of development, and under the impact of political change. Now, at the same time, urbanization gave rise to new patterns of revolt in cities. So prior to 1985, 70% of revolutionary episodes that occurred in cities were armed. Since 1985, 73% of revolutionary episodes in cities have been unarmed. So revolution in cities today has come to be based more on the power of numbers rather than the power of arms. And I call this in the book the urban civic revolutionary repertoire, and you'll see why I call it that in a while. But the book explores the rising incidence of these urban civic revolutions based on the power of numbers and how they've fueled a growth in revolutionary contention around the world. The world is becoming more revolutionary in the sense that I am talking about it, the processes that these urban civic revolutions involve, and the consequences that they bring about afterwards. So to tie all this together, I develop a spatial theory of revolution that's rooted in the differences between revolutionary processes in cities and revolutionary processes in the countryside. I argue that these differences are related to different types of social networks and built environments and so on, but they're also closely related to the role of cities as centers of state and economic power. Revolutionary challenges in cities take place precisely where the coercive capacity of the state is strongest. It's where the police are thickest, for instance, and the ability of governments to repress revolutionary movements is highest in cities. But cities are where regimes are also most vulnerable due to the thickened presence of government nerve centers of power and commerce. And the ultimate goal of all revolutions is to capture those nerve centers of power. They all seek eventually to capture power in cities, even if they start in the countryside. So in this sense, proximity of revolt to centers of power, I argue, magnifies the stakes and risks of revolution for both rebels and for regimes. And I refer to this as the proximity dilemma in revolution. It's essentially a trade-off that's associated with being close to centers of power. And I use this trade-off as a basic frame for understanding revolutionary processes and how they've evolved over time. So there's an analogous trade-off in nature. Some of you may know. Evolutionary biologists call it the growth versus predation risk trade-off. And it's a fancy name for the fact that the most efficient sites for feeding for animals are also the most dangerous sites for animals to fall to predators. Predators also congregate in those very same locations. And so members of a species can navigate that trade-off differently, but generally over time, they learn how to adjust their behavior. Natural selection also clicks in order to balance the risks and the rewards. So animals may, for instance, alter where they and how long they feed, or when they feed, the timing of feeding. They may engage in herding behaviors or migratory behaviors. They might devote a portion of their feeding time to vigilance, to making sure that they're safe. Natural selection can lead toward developing certain camouflage and escape capabilities. So the repression disruption trade-off in revolution operates somewhat similarly. It can be managed by spatial relocation, for instance, moving further away from government centers of power. By doing that, a revolutionary opposition can better avoid government repression, but it does so at the expense of its ability to disrupt, its disruptive efficiency. The repression disruption trade-off can also be managed through learning behavior, specifically through tactical choice by regimes and oppositions. So tactics that increase an opposition's ability to disrupt or to decrease its exposure to a regime's repressive capacity, for instance, are likely to be more efficient at inducing regime change, while government tactics that increase an opposition's exposure to a regime's repressive capacity or decrease its ability to disrupt are likely to be more effective at repressing revolutionary challenges. And finally, like the effects of climate change on natural selection, the slope of this repression disruption trade-off function itself can be affected by big-scale structural changes in the environment. These can push it in a more favorable direction for regimes or a more favorable direction for oppositions. So in the diagram here, the trade-off function is x sub 0, but it can be pushed in the direction of x sub 1 or x sub 2. And these types of structural changes can occur as a result of changes in the environment that render oppositions more or less exposed to regime repression, or regimes more or less vulnerable to opposition disruption. Changes like shifts in the nature of political and economic power, or changing social structures or network structures, or new technologies of rebellion or counterinsurgency, new forms of communication, or shifting currents of geopolitics. And as I argue in the book, these structural changes are usually more intensely felt in cities, where governments and oppositions are more exposed to technological innovations, changes in the character of government, and global economic and geopolitical forces. But I also argue that urbanization has altered the repression-disruption trade-off more directly. And it's done that by concentrating large numbers of people in close proximity to centers of state power, connecting them in new ways and producing new spaces and social forces for challenging regimes. So this dilemma that I just outlined, and I'm sorry if it was somewhat complex, but it basically has had some profound effects. So for example, lethal violence, deadly violence, it has opposite effects in rural revolutions and than in urban revolutions. So in rural revolutions, more lethal violence is associated with a higher likelihood of opposition victory. The more violence, the more likely it is in a rural revolution for the opposition to come to power. In cities, precisely the opposite is true. Armed insurrections are more effective in the countryside where rebels can hide from government retaliation, but in cities, armed insurrections expose revolutionaries to the full repressive capacity of the state, with rebels outgunned, outnumbered, and outmatched by government forces. That's why generally over time, armed insurrection has been pushed out. So in cities. So the proximity dilemma is also one of the key reasons why social revolutions, which until the early 20th century had occurred almost exclusively as armed rebellions in cities, by the middle of the 20th century came to be waged predominantly from the countryside. As the state's firepower in cities grew, the old-fashioned way of making social revolutions through armed revolt in cities, through barricades and so on, that had a very low rate of success. But beginning in the 1920s, and especially during the Cold War, the Chinese Revolution was the key event here as the sort of initiator of this process. A ruralization of social revolution took place as social revolutionaries migrated to the countryside where they used distance from government centers and rough terrain to hide from government retaliation. So essentially, Mao and other social revolutionaries traded capacity to disrupt directly for safety from government repression. And as a result of that move to the countryside, they discovered peasants as a revolutionary force. Peasants traditionally had been viewed as a reactionary force, focused specifically on their individual access to land. But by the move of revolutionaries to the countryside, peasants became a key social force underpinning social revolution. So the proximity dilemma also helps explain why numbers don't matter that much in the outcomes of rural revolutions. Generating numbers is not only difficult in rural revolutions, given low population densities, but crowds in the countryside really don't present much of a threat. Large crowds don't present much of a threat to governments because they're located far from government nerve centers of power. So by contrast, large crowds are not only easier to assemble in cities, but they also threaten regimes more directly. So large unarmed revolts in cities can potentially fend off regime repression because governments are often reticent to shoot into unarmed large crowds. They also can provoke defections from a regime's ruling coalition. So if armed revolution in cities faces a low probability of success due to the overwhelming coercive power of the state, revolutions in cities that rely on the power of numbers have actually performed much better. And as I show, though, and as these figures indicate as well, there are diminishing returns to numbers in cities. It's really only at extremely large numbers that the odds truly tip in favor of revolutionary oppositions. So essentially, the movement of hundreds of millions of people into cities over the past century rendered possible new repertoires for challenging regimes in cities based on the power of numbers rather than the power of arms. So as urbanization proceeded, the ability to mobilize exceptionally large numbers in cities grew increasingly feasible. So take, for instance, the city of Kiev, a city where I've spent a good deal of time, and which is also now, of course, trying to recover from a brutal Russian siege. Kiev experienced multiple revolutionary uprisings over the past 120 years. But over that time, the way in which revolt has been carried out has changed enormously, has shifted toward reliance on the power of numbers rather than on the power of arms. So during the revolution of 1905 in Kiev, the population of Kiev could not have carried out the kind of massive mobilizations carried out by the Orange Revolution a century later in 2004. The size of Kiev in 1905, 330,000, was simply too small to generate the kinds of crowds that would have been necessary to protect unarmed protesters against repression and exerting leverage through the power of numbers. But by 2004, Kiev was a major metropolitan center of 2.6 million people, 8 times its population in 1905, which provided a propitious base for mobilizing crowds of up to 1 million people. Now, as I detail in the book, there were also other reasons why the power of numbers was not an available strategy before the late 20th century. So governments at the beginning of the 20th century were significantly more likely to ride over or shoot into unarmed crowds than governments are today, making unarmed rebellion in cities a very risky affair. So in the first half of the 20th century, deaths in unarmed rebellions were on average 6 times greater than they were in the post-Cold War period. And as a result, participants in revolutionary demonstrations frequently had to arm themselves in order to protect themselves from government attack. But as I show in the book, the widespread application of so-called non-lethal technologies of crowd control from the middle of the 20th century onward greatly reduced fatalities in urban revolution and made unarmed revolt in cities more feasible. Moreover, technologies for coordinating large crowds in the early 20th century were pretty primitive. They were severely limited in their reach. So not until the Nazis applied sound amplification to street rallies in the 1930s could people actually hear speakers at rallies at more than a distance of 10 meters. So when you see in movies people addressing some large group of people, and supposedly they're nodding their heads in agreement, that's just not true. Sound couldn't be heard more than about 10 meters. And due to the constraints of communication systems, revolutionary movements in cities tended to rely on highly localized neighborhood and factory networks. That also limited the size of mobilizations. But by the late 20th century, as we know, technological innovations and the proliferation of large, resourced, highly networked populations in close proximity to the state's nerve centers of power altered the possibility for making urban revolution through the power of numbers. That's the basic story of the book. It tilted this repression disruption function in favor of urban oppositions. So this is what I call the urban civic repertoire, that is uprisings that seek to overthrow abusive governments by mobilizing as many people as possible in central urban spaces, aiming at regime change through the power of numbers rather than armed revolt or street fighting or strikes or urban rioting. So since 1985, urban civic revolutions have constituted 2/5 of all revolutionary episodes around the world and 3/5 of all urban revolutions. They've become the most prevalent form of revolution in the world today. So revolution today is mostly an urban phenomenon. Prior to 1985, 55% of revolutionary episodes occurred predominantly in the countryside. Since 1985, more than 2/3 of revolutionary episodes have occurred predominantly in cities. So contemporary urban revolutions have been associated with a different set of social forces than social revolutions. Not peasants, but rather the urban middle class has participated disproportionately, but usually with sizable contingents of other urban groups, such as skilled workers, small business owners, students, and the unemployed. Students have been a particularly important group. So by bringing large numbers closer to the nerve centers of power, by creating cities of sufficient size for oppositions to be able to utilize the power of numbers, by connecting them together in new ways, by producing new social forces participating in revolution, urbanization has actually led to a growth in the frequency of revolutions around the world. And as I show in the book, this increase in frequency of revolution has been driven by the proliferation of urban revolutions, and in particular, by the proliferation of urban civic revolutions, relying on the power of numbers. So much of the book is devoted to understanding the implications of this return of revolution to the city and the rise of this urban civic repertoire. So for instance, as the proximity dilemma might anticipate, rural revolutions and to a lesser extent social revolutions are closely associated with weak states. States in particular that can't penetrate their own territory, what the sociologist Michael Mann called weak infrastructural power. Urban and urban civic revolutions, by contrast, are not associated with weak infrastructural power, with weak states. They occur precisely where the state is strongest, that is in cities. And in fact, they don't hide from state power, they confront state power directly in the open. So in one of the book's chapters, I develop a statistical model, a probabilistic model of the onset of urban civic revolutions. And I use that model to show that urban civic revolutions actually are associated with different factors than social revolutions, than other types of revolutions and other forms of political instability. And so really you couldn't have some kind of universal theory of revolutions, of all revolutions, simply because revolution has been put to a diversity of purposes over time, with a lot of different social forces involved and different changing world historical circumstances. So my book doesn't try to develop a universal theory of revolutions. It tries to develop a theory about how revolution has evolved over time. So unlike social revolutions, which were shaped by poverty, land inequality, and state weakness, contemporary urban revolutions are more closely related to the coercive and predatory powers of the state. So they've been much more sensitive to regime type and have generally materialized against regimes that were more autocratic, more personalist, more repressive, more corrupt than those revolutions that were social revolutions. So according to the World Values Survey, urban dwellers around the world have shown a particular concern about issues of corruption. For instance, city dwellers are much less likely to believe that it's justifiable to bribe an official than are rural inhabitants. And that relationship is particularly strong for inhabitants of large cities, cities over 500,000 inhabitants. So viewed in that light, it's perhaps not surprising that many of the grievances that permeate urban civic revolutions revolve around reclaiming the public sphere from corrupt, arbitrary, despotic government. So essentially, as societies urbanized and moved in closer proximity to centers of state power, as states proliferated and consolidated, the state came to matter more in people's lives. And populations came into more regular contact with the state, including, of course, the state's unequaled capacity for predation and corruption. Now, I also used this model, this probabilistic model, to examine the roles played by structure and agency in the outbreak of revolutions. Now, the model correctly predicts above average risk for about 80% of the urban civic revolutions that actually have occurred around the world, which is a pretty good record. Clearly, urban civic revolutions are structured. They're structured by particular factors. They mostly occur where we would expect them to occur, according to those structural factors. But the structural model, like all structural models, seriously overpredicts revolution. As I show, it overpredicts revolution even in the presence of potential triggering events. So through a series of 16 case studies, including case studies of the 1998 revolution in Indonesia and the failure of revolution to emerge in Malaysia around the same time, where conditions were quite similar, I used the model's prediction to assess the predictions of risk of revolution to assess why revolution did or did not emerge, where the risk was high. And I showed the importance of regime opposition interactions in the materialization of revolutions. So I liken revolutions to hurricanes. The typical way in which revolutions have traditionally been talked about in the literature is that they're either earthquakes that suddenly appear or wildfires that suddenly burst into flames. And I don't know how much you know about hurricanes. In your part of the world, they're known as typhoons or cyclones. But typically, hurricanes begin as a small tropical disturbance over the ocean due to the interaction between the warm surface water and the upper atmosphere. However, only a small proportion of those disturbances ever develop into major storms, between 1 and 2%. And only half of that 1 and 2% that develop into major storms ever reach hurricane strength. So that outcome is the product of interactive processes, in particular, vertical wind shear. Too much vertical wind shear breaks those tropical disturbances apart. Moreover, many hurricanes never reach land, they die at sea. Others slam into coastal regions, causing enormous damage. And while there's a seeming randomness to the emergence and trajectory of each storm, hurricanes are clearly structured phenomena. I mean, they occur over the long run with distinct patterns. They occur, for instance, more frequently in the Atlantic basin. As a result of the warming of the oceans, they've been growing more frequent over time. Much like revolutions have been growing more frequent over time. So I argue in the book that this combination of structural conduciveness and uncertain emergence is how we should think about revolutions. Revolutions emerge probabilistically with a certain level of risk. They don't emerge automatically, but they emerge largely in those places where we would expect them to be. But there are plenty of instances in which they fail to develop, even in the presence of conducive conditions and potential triggers. And these dynamic interactions between regimes and oppositions, what each side does to one another, and the reactions to that, they play a critical role in determining whether this tropical disturbance will grow into a full-scale hurricane. So the book then delves down into the revolutionary episode itself. It dissects the processes that occur within urban revolutions, how those compare with revolutionary contention in the countryside. Because proximity to centers of power heightens the risks involved in revolution, it turns urban revolutions into highly condensed conflicts that take place over the course of days and weeks rather than over years, as is true of rural revolutions. So this compression of time in urban revolutions creates significant problems for regimes and oppositions. It creates information problems similar to what in chess, in the game of chess, is called Zeitnot, or time trouble. That is, in chess, when the game is played with a clock, players make errors due to the pressure of the clock. And in rural revolutions, battles between rebels and governments are intermittent. They have a punctuated character. They don't occur all the time. They occur gradually or intermittently over a period of time. And rarely does a single battle determine the outcome of a rural revolution. But urban revolutions are different. Urban revolutions are condensed into a single battle. Battles in rural revolutions can be confusing, they can be mistake-prone, but rural revolutions are more forgiving due to the remoteness of the state and the impenetrability of terrain. So in most instances, these provide a buffer for rebels and regimes to recover from their mistakes. But in urban revolutions, mistakes, errors occur right where the state's coercive power is concentrated and where the nerve centers of power are concentrated. And as I show through numerous examples in the book, that heightens the impact of errors on the outcomes of revolution. In urban revolutions, not only are errors more frequent due to the condensed character of these revolutions, but their consequences are also more direct and immediate. So the book also contrasts the spatial dimensions of rural revolts and urban armed revolts with those of urban civic revolts based on the power of numbers. So in contrast to urban armed revolts, which treat the cityscape, the built environment of the city as if it were rough terrain, as if it were like a rural revolution, they use it as protection from government attack, as you can see in this picture. Urban civic revolutions attempt to take advantage of the spaces between buildings. They take advantage of the empty space of the public square and the boulevard for mobilizing large numbers to disrupt political and commercial life. They don't hide from government repression. They incur in full view of the nation and the world, and of course, in full view of the police, in centrally located public spaces in proximity to centers of power. So visibility is one of the features of the urban environment that they seek to exploit. And with the rise of television and the internet, of course, visuality, simultaneity, and transnationality have become increasingly central to revolutionary processes. So as states proliferated and as urbanization proceeded, large open spaces in proximity to centers of power spread throughout the world, especially in capital cities. So Kiev's Maidan, for instance, developed into a vast revolutionary space, in part due to the destruction of the city during World War II and the ways in which the communist regime refashioned the area into a staging ground for parades, for glorification of the Soviet government. It's not unusual. This happens in many countries. And in the book, I examine the making and remaking of this revolutionary public space over time. I explore how the shape, location, availability, and symbolic value of this public space affect the manner in which interactions between regimes and oppositions in revolutionary contention unfold. As rural counterinsurgency doctrine emphasizes, in rural revolutions, it's not control over space that determines the outcome, but rather control over so-called hearts and minds. That is, control over the political loyalty of people who inhabit the space. In urban revolutions, and especially in urban civic revolutions that rely on the power of numbers, outcomes are not about control over power, over hearts and minds. It's rather for a struggle for control over public space. That is, public space, especially in close proximity to government nerve centers of power. And as I show in the book, the closer an urban civic opposition is able to come to nerve centers of power, the more likely it is to leverage success. So the closer it can get to the president's palace, for instance, or the center of government, the nerve center of government, the more likely it is to leverage success. And I explore the ways in which regimes have attempted to insulate themselves from these challenges by keeping our urban civic challenges away from these nerve centers of government, dislocating them to the periphery of the city. So in short, much of urban revolutionary contention today is about a struggle for control over public space. So then the book descends still further. It goes to the level of the individuals participating in these urban civic revolutions using the surveys that I mentioned before. And as I show, revolutionary processes that concentrate hundreds of thousands of people into central urban spaces in a matter of days or weeks, as urban civic revolutions do, they draw on a very wide variety of grievances and political forces. So to maximize numbers in a concentrated period of time, these revolutions typically forge a broad negative coalition, constructed in a makeshift manner. They pull in all who favor removal of the incumbent regime, irrespective of purpose or political beliefs. They rely on hastily assembled coalitional leaderships, and sometimes no leadership at all, and inclusive civic nationalism, a broadly civic minimalist demands of reclaiming state power from corrupt and abusive governments. This is a kind of least common denominator that can attract as many participants as possible. So unlike social revolutions typically led by hierarchical organizations, the leaderships of urban civic revolutions have neither the desire nor the opportunity to socialize participants into a common set of values. They don't have the time to do that. The surveys show that participants in these revolutions were actually more diverse in their political identities, as this image here shows, more diverse in their political identities and opinions on key public policy issues than either those who support the revolution but didn't participate or those who opposed revolution. Now, urban civic revolutions are often interpreted as democratic revolutions, but there are a number of reasons why I don't call them that in the book. For one thing, there have been a number of revolutions espousing liberal aims, espousing democratic aims that didn't rely on the power of numbers. And in fact, most revolutions espousing liberal aims up through the middle of the 20th century were actually armed revolts. But more importantly, as the surveys show, corruption and economic issues were actually most frequently cited by participants in the surveys, participants in these revolutions as the reasons why they participated in them. Corruption and economic issues, while the desire for political freedoms was actually cited by only a minority. So accordingly, most participants in these revolutions demonstrate a weak commitment to democratic values. So I give a number of examples of that here on the slide. You can see, for instance, only 33% of Orange Revolution participants and 52% of Euromaidan participants believed that Ukraine needed a multi-party system. Well, if you don't have a multi-party system, then you don't have a core feature of what is essentially a political democracy. So another example, 63% of participants in the Egyptian Revolution, when they were asked what is democracy, they named providing basic food items or narrowing the gap between rich and poor as the most important features of a democracy. Only 10% named the opportunity to change their government or freedom to criticize the government. So really, urban civic revolutions are better understood as revolutions against repressive and abusive government than revolutions for democracy. They're more about what people are struggling against than what they're struggling for. And that's an important point I think we don't often recognize. So generally speaking, revolutions don't produce democracies. It's what happens after revolution that determines whether a democracy develops and whether it remains present. So one of the contributions of the book is its systematic comparison of developments after revolution, comparing the effects of social revolutions and urban civic revolutions, in particular on a number of issues, on political order, on economic growth, on inequality, political freedoms, and government accountability. For instance, I show that successful urban civic revolutions do lead to substantial improvements in political freedoms and government accountability relative to pre-revolutionary regimes. But as I also show, those achievements fall short of average levels of electoral democracies, minimally defined over the past century, and they tend to deteriorate over time. Also, in terms of the rule of law, these regimes fall far short of average levels exhibited by electoral democracies. Most importantly, urban civic revolutions don't push aside the state. They rather inherit the pre-revolutionary state intact with all its embedded relationships of corruption. And as a result, corruption remains at very high levels after these revolutions. As you can see here, not much different from pre-revolutionary levels of corruption, which were usually a cause of revolution in the first place, practically identical with levels of corruption in failed urban civic revolutions, and far, far higher than the average level of corruption across all electoral democracies. So urban civic revolutions also, as I show in the book, tend to generate greater economic inequality and sluggish economic growth. Finally, because urban civic revolutions are extremely compact in time and involve a hastily constructed negative coalition, they produce post-revolutionary governments that are more fractious and less durable than governments brought to power by social revolutions. And as you can see here, from a survival analysis of post-revolutionary regimes, revolutions that occur within a highly compressed period of time generally produce post-revolutionary regimes that don't last that long in power. So 3 out of every 5 successful urban revolutions experience 2 months or less of revolutionary contention. Statistically speaking, these new regimes had less than a 50-50 chance of surviving for more than 6 years. So this gives you some taste of some of the things that I deal with in the Revolutionary City. My goals in writing this book were to explain how and why revolutions have evolved over time, to develop a theory of revolution that's relevant for the urban world in which we now live, and to bring to bear new forms of information on revolutions that would help us to understand revolutionary phenomena in a new way. So hopefully I've been able to convey some of that to you in my talk today, and to pique your interest in learning more. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for the clear and impressive material, Professor Beissinger. And once again, welcome to Indonesia in virtual meeting. So actually, Professor, we have in the beginning of this meeting, actually we have opening remarks by one of our lecturers at Department of Political Science. If you don't mind, can you give the chance for us to give opening remarks or such a comment regarding to your book?
I'd be happy. I'd be happy to have that.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor. Okay, selamat malam, Mas Angga, Bapak Airlangga pribadi.
Selamat malam. Good night.
Yeah. So this is our lecturer at Department of Political Science. Bapak Airlangga pribadi will give such a comment regarding to your book. Please welcome Mas Angga.
Okay. Thank you, Mbak Nuke, for the opportunity. Welcome to the Airlangga University, Professor Mark Beissinger. I think you read the excellent book about the revolution, and I just have some comments about that. The first is if we read your book, especially I just finished the introductory chapter for your book. You said that the one factor that can be differentiated between the classical revolution and contemporary urban revolution is about the contemporary one are not placed political organizations such as the political parties or vanguard parties as the the fundamental factors for the process of revolutions. And then, in my opinion, maybe this is one of the weakness part of the contemporary revolution or urban civic revolution in the 21st century, because without the revolutionary party or political organization party, the contemporary revolution lack the solid program, coherent basis, and the political machine to consolidate the people to sustain the process of revolution or prevent the strike from the counter revolution or from the status quo social forces after the day of revolutions. If we consider the book from the Asef Bayat, he write about the revolution with a revolution without revolutionary. He said that the fail of the Arab Spring in the moment of the 2013s is about the revolution moments happen without the revolutionary political agents. That's why the status quo and all social forces can take over and give strike back to the revolution. It happened also in Indonesia after 1998, because yes, we can change the political system from the authoritarian into democratic, but the social forces and the character of power still still created the predatory and corrupted and repressive tendency in the post-authoritarian era. So what is your opinion about that? And the second is, in the introduction, you said about the influence of the neoliberal conditions in the revolutionary process that shape the character of movement. So that's why we can show that the prominent actors for the revolution is about the middle class, precarious middle class, and precarious people, students, because they say that the problem is about the predatory power and the authoritarian. But yes, and then how you can elaborate more deeply about the influence of the neoliberalization structural circumstance to the process of revolution today? I think that's one. Thank you.
Those are great comments. Thank you very much. Yes, I think one of the key features, in fact, I emphasize this in the book, is the fact that these urban civic revolutions come together very quickly with the very large numbers of people as their diversity and the lack of coherent political organization.
Yes.
So the absence of political parties to guide a revolution has a very profound effect on what happens after revolution in particular. So it means that the governments that are formed out of these revolutions are much more fractious. They don't last that long, people are pulled together of a great variety of political views, and I show this, empirically in the book. And the absence of that political power, that political party to be able to socialize people into a common set of values, it makes a huge difference. But this is how revolutions occur today in cities, right? It is a fact of life in some ways. I'm not sure that we can turn the clock back and create new revolutionary parties in the same way that they were before. We have to recognize this pattern and figure out ways of dealing with it in some ways. So, Bayat's work on this is really excellent. The revolution without revolutionaries. This is not just an Egyptian story. This is a story of Ukraine. It's a story of Indonesia. It's a story of Tunisia. It's actually a fairly general pattern. And so one of the things I try to do in the book is to show how this is a general pattern. That is the lack of stability of post-revolutionary governments, the inability to push aside the old state and inheriting, the corruption of the old state as a result of these urban civic revolutions. So, and what I'm doing in the book is not making an argument against revolution, in essence. What I'm trying to make what I'm trying to do is to sensitize people to the reality of the situation and the issues that need to be dealt with in revolution. People embark on revolutions because they feel they, as Jeff Goodwin says in his 2001 book, they feel they have no other way out. There are no other possibilities for them to deal with the pressing problems that are really hurting them. And so revolutions in that sense, I think, are always tragedies. They're tragedies. They may be necessary tragedies, but they're always tragedies. And they lead to some improvements, and I show that in the book. But they also leave some things unchanged, and sometimes they worsen certain other things. And we just need to be to understand that fact. In terms of neoliberalism, the Indonesian Revolution in 1998 was a great case of sort of the impacts of neoliberalism in some ways, right, on revolution, and particularly on the urban revolution. And it is one of the main patterns that is out there in terms of these urban civic revolutions. So the Middle East revolutions were also cases of this, in which price increases, increases on electricity, sort of brought about by pressure, neoliberal pressures, unemployment, middle-class unemployment. This was a big factor in Tunisia, in the Tunisian revolution, due again to pressures to contract the state, brought about through neoliberalism. This has been one of the main patterns through which these urban civic revolutions have occurred, but it's not the only pattern. So, yes. In fact, I don't find a statistical association between economic growth in the year prior to an urban civic revolution and the outbreak of urban civic revolution. And the reason why is because there's a great deal of diversity. So there are cases in which these revolutions are not fueled necessarily by economic decline, but rather by the growth of the middle class and the desire to deal with the pervasive corruption of the regime. So there's a great deal of diversity that occurs among them. But neoliberalism has definitely been one of the central factors that has helped precipitate urban civic revolutions in a significant number of cases.
Thank you, Professor.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Beissinger and Bapak Erlangga pribadi for the comment. Okay, it's time Q&A session. For all the participants, if you have any question, you can raise your hand or write them down on the chat box. Okay. Okay, the first question from Nadi Fiansyah. Okay, please.
Yes, good evening, Mr. Mark Beissinger. I'm from the political science student, and I would like to ask, after the 98 revolution in Indonesia, in many organizations like a human rights organization in Indonesia wants Indonesia to ratify the Rome Statute. Now, on your opinion, why Indonesia didn't ratify the Rome Statute? So in the case, human rights violation cases in the past can be brought to the International Court of Criminal in the Den Haag. So what is your opinion about why Indonesia didn't ratify the Rome Statute?
I don't know enough about that to be able to answer in a reasoned way. So I apologize for evading the question, but I don't want to lead you with false information.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for the answer. Nadi Fiansyah, yeah, because this book discussion is about revolution, mainly in the post-Union Soviet. And if you have any comment for all the participants? Okay, Nadi Fiansyah, you want to ask again?
Yes, I want to ask again.
Okay.
Yeah, why? Because this topic is about a revolution. Why communism in the Eastern Europe, like in the Soviet Union, in the Czech Republic, in the Baltic state, in the East Germany has been falling out, but in some countries like China, Vietnam, and Cuba, communism is still growing. So people thinks that thought that after the dissolution of the Union Soviet, the next Cold War is between China and the United States. It's like that. So why communism in China, in Vietnam, in Cuba is still growing rapidly, but in the Eastern Europe is been falling down?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there've been a number of scholars who have tried to address it. So I think the reason why communism survived largely in Asia as opposed to in Eastern Europe was the ability of Asian communist regimes to harness nationalism. Harness nationalism to purposes of the regime and to maintaining the regime. So the Soviet Union was not able to do that, in part because it was a multinational state. Only 52% of the population was Russian, but also its nationalities policies had kind of consolidated strong ethnic identities. Plus, in Eastern Europe, communism in most parts of Eastern Europe was imposed by the Soviet army. So there was a national dimension to the East European revolutions. They were revolting not just against their communist regimes, but also against Soviet control over Eastern Europe. And those regimes were very closely associated with that control. So the regimes that were able to mobilize their populations to their own support using nationalism, like Cuba, like China, like North Korea, like Vietnam, those were the ones that were able to survive. So I think that's the key. Of course, I mean, there are other issues too. For China, it reinvented itself economically. Vietnam did as well. But I don't think you could say that Cuba has survived because of its economic reinvention. It hasn't reinvented itself.
Yeah, I see. In Obama administration, the U.S. Government wants to revoke the Cuba sanctions, but again, after Trump become president, the administration reimpose the sanction to Cuba. So what are the reason of why Cuba is being resanctioned again on the administration of the Donald Trump before?
Yeah, it has a lot to do with the fact that there's a large Cuban emigre community in the United States, particularly in Florida, which is a strategic state in American elections. And so in order to court that Cuban emigre community, which is very anti-communist, against the Castro, no longer Castro government, but what was the Castro government, in order to court them, Trump revoked it. Now, there is division within that Cuban emigre community. Many of them have relatives in Cuba. Many of them were enjoyed being able to travel to Cuba, to see their relatives, to send money, and so on. But that was not the majority of those Cuban emigres, and Trump really exploited that. And he actually, I would say, captured the state of Florida as a result of that. But one thing that loosening did allow was for me to travel to Cuba. So I did go to Cuba during that period of time. It was very interesting for me, and reminded me a lot of my days living in the Soviet Union.
And the last question from me is, why the post-Soviet states like Azerbaijan, Belarus, Kazakhstan is going to become an authoritarian country? Why? What are the reasons of the post-Soviet state still maintaining their authoritarian regime, like Lukashenko in the Belarus, Aliyev in the Azerbaijan, Nazarbayev in the Kazakhstan, Putin in Russia, and what are the reasons why this post-Soviet state is still maintaining their authoritarianism?
Yeah, well, when the Soviet Union collapsed, these were areas where the old communist elite was still in power, and they were able to consolidate their rule in those areas. So what was called the nomenclatura that is that old elite. So Nazarbayev was the communist boss of Kazakhstan at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now he, one of the things that these former communist leaders had to do was to reinvent themselves. They had to reinvent themselves from loyal functionaries of the Soviet state into the fathers, or, well, they were all men, but the fathers of their country, right? To evoke sort of feelings of patriotism and nationalism around their units. And so they all did that. So Nazarbayev, was very successful in doing that. Aliyev in Azerbaijan, he wasn't there when the Soviet Union collapsed, but he led a revolt against the government and was able to consolidate it. Now he, one of the things about these old leaders was they retained the networks, the old networks of the communist state, and the loyalty of people within them. So that allowed them to consolidate their rule. In those places where you had some more openness, particularly the Baltic states, Ukraine, I wouldn't call necessarily a democracy in the early 1990s, but it was more of a democracy than, let's say, what was happening in Azerbaijan. Even Russia, was a more competitive system at that time. It's not now under Putin, but it was at that time. And those were places where you had a lot of political unrest that took place at the time of the Soviet collapse, and even pushed was a major factor in pushing the Soviet Union towards collapse. Those massive protests that occurred from 1988 to 1991, and that's what my earlier book on the collapse of the Soviet Union is essentially about. That wave of nationalist mobilization in the Baltic states, in Ukraine, in Moldova, in Russia, and elsewhere. Didn't happen so much in Central Asia, and it happened in Georgia and in Azerbaijan, in Azerbaijan and Armenia, but it didn't happen in Central Asia.
Okay, thank you for your explanation this night.
Okay, thank you, Diviansha, for the question, and thank you, Professor Beissinger, for the clear answer. So there are several questions on the chat box. Okay, can I read them to you? Okay, the first question is, what is the interesting thing from Indonesian 1998 revolution, or we usually call it reformation, that you put it inside your book? What is the interesting part from
sorry, what is the, could you repeat the question again?
What is the interesting part from Indonesia 1998 revolution, or we call it reformation, that you put inside your book?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well, several things, I think. One was sort of the way in which it overthrew a leader who had been in power for a very, very long time and actually fit within the pattern of other urban civic revolutions. So there is a relationship between sort of repressive leaders who have been in power for a very long time and urban civic revolution. So that's one thing which caused me to talk about the Indonesian Revolution. But then, of course, there was the issue of the Asian financial crisis and how that helped to precipitate things. And finally, the role of students was absolutely critical in the Indonesian Revolution, which is, a fairly common pattern. It's not the only pattern that's there, but sort of especially the sort of middle-class students. Students are kind of an interesting category, because students are in between in the social structure in some ways, right? So they don't occupy a clear class space within the social structure. They're what some sociologists call the non-commodified or the uncommodified. They're not selling their labor on the labor market. not like workers or farmers and so on. So they are taken out of that structure for a while. And so that has allowed them, one of the factors that has allowed them to play a critical role in modern revolution. And that role goes back a long way. They still play a disproportionate role. But mostly, the growth of education has been a factor that has also played into revolutions in a number of cases. So I know in the case, I don't know what the patterns of growth of revolution in Indonesia were prior to 1998, but I do know, for instance, in Thailand, the very rapid growth of education prior to 1973 was a critical factor that helped to set off those events in Thailand. I mean, an enormous expansion of the university system. So these are all things which drew me to the Indonesian case. And then there was the contrast with Malaysia that I draw in the book. So I mean, Malaysia suffered just as badly from the financial crisis as did Indonesia. And there was a movement that, a kind of effort to imitate reformasi in Indonesia. And that didn't pan out, in part because the regime was much more capable of repressing that movement. But I kind of show the sort of critical aspects of these interactions that take place between regimes and governments. So, I mean, I think Suharto also, in my discussion, I argued that Suharto made some bad mistakes in terms of the way in which he handled student protests, in 1998. So he, first of all, the fact that he, in the middle of this financial economic crisis, decides to announce that he's going to run again for political office as an older man who's been in power for a very long time, was one critical mistake, which set the revolution off. But then, the repression against students, and then there were the riots that occurred as well, for which there was a backlash. I think Indonesia exhibits a lot of interesting factors that one finds in that one can place into a comparative perspective.
Okay, thank you so much for the answer. Okay, there is a next question from Ferdian. Hello, Ferdian. On the chat box, because it's quite long. Maybe if you want to, Ferdian, hello. Maybe if you want to ask directly to Professor Beissinger. Okay. Okay, there's no response from Ferdian. Okay, I will try to.
I can look at the question here.
Okay. Even the discourse of social movement, brought by the urban middle class, which often involves students' movement, could still carry the demand of decent wealth and fair distribution or ethnic minority livelihood brought to the to the urban middle class movement. At this point, they advocate the needs of the public, even usually far from their neighborhood. We will understand these movements are for good intentions, but it somehow would lack in relative touch. Is there a way for a movement to be effective in achieving what they want to advocate in such condition, and the way the locals and the outsiders or the general public perceive it would have been different, which could complicate matters?
Okay. Well, one aspect of that question is about whether urban movement can represent the interests of peasants, for instance. Well, that would depend on the connections, I would think, between the urban population and rural populations. And there are instances in which peasants do come into cities and mobilize. So we've seen an instance of that in India not too long ago, a social movement, not a revolution, a social movement in which peasants, particularly farmers, came to the city and essentially occupied the city for a while because they felt that they were being hurt by government, the removal of government subsidies. So that can be an effective strategy, but it's not easy for rural populations to sustain that kind of movement in a city. Another case that occurred was in Nepal. In Nepal, there was an instance of a revolution in which peasants essentially came to the city. They came to the city and were the main population of the urban revolution. But that's relatively unusual, and Nepal is one of the least urbanized countries in the world. It's something like 13% of Nepal is urban. So that pattern is unusual. Ethnic minorities, it's not unusual for urban civic revolutions to contain an element of cultural demands, but and they tend to be broadly civic in terms of trying to mobilize as many people as possible. But it makes it much harder for them to represent the interests of minorities. And in fact, often in the wake of urban civic revolutions, relations between ethnic minorities and ethnic majorities worsen as a result of the revolution. Because when you mobilize large numbers of people, it tends to come from ethnic majorities, unfortunately, or fortunately, whatever way it is. But it does exacerbate relationships. But issues of culture penetrate these revolutions. Issues of religion often penetrate these revolutions. The Egyptian revolution, of course, religion played a major role, as it did in other uprisings in the Middle East. So we shouldn't think that it's all about economics and not about culture as well. So it's part of it. But it is hard for minorities when you rely on the power of numbers to mobilize. Now, there are social movements that are different. You could have a social movement that represents an ethnic minority or represents peasants. But in order to exert power, exert leverage on government, again, they need to come to cities today to be disruptive within the context of cities. And so I think the urban element of it is an enormous shift that has occurred within the world that affects both social movements and revolutions.
Okay. Thank
Okay, it looks like there's a follow-up question. So there could be a debate about which administration are in charge of matters once it's brought to the movement. Is it the regional or central government who should solve matters? Does this trend also shift in some ways over the course of history about which administration should take care of matters regarding movements? I think that's a really good question. I don't know if I have, whether we have good information about that. My sense is that over time, central governments have been held more and more responsible as power has concentrated in central governments. But governments differ. Some governments decentralize, and that can often be a way to deflect demands away from the center by decentralizing power down to the local or federal level. And there you might, you don't carry out a revolution against the local government. That doesn't happen. But it could, push movements, push people more into the direction of a social movement rather than a revolution by decentralizing. And there are a number of scholars who do make that argument that localization, federalization is one strategy that regimes could use in order to push mobilization more in, or push it less in a less revolutionary way.
Okay, Ferdian, is it clear enough to you?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you for your explanation, Professor Beissinger from Ferdian. Okay, for other participants in here, okay, there is another question from Charis, please.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to ask. I am Charis from the political science major in Airlangga University, and I would like to ask you about the digital revolution, as it is really emerging right now and is more likely to be occur in urban areas, as what you have said. And I noticed that you already mentioned in your presentation that the lethal violence, the act of violence and repression had done opposite effects with urban revolution, like it didn't work as well in the previous era. And I do read a literature which says that revolution is actually a war between ideas, between quote unquote fictional entities of the government and the opposite or the side which do the revolution. So I want to ask, what do you think about this idea of war of fictional entities about the revolution? Do you agree with it? And the second question is, what do you think the digital revolution will be like to be? Who takes the biggest advantage of the digital revolution? Is it the government, the opposites, or NGOs, and so on? And what do you think it would be like? Is it will be more stable, or is it just the same chaotic as revolutions that we ever known, or it will be more chaotic just in a different way? Thank you.
And those are great questions. So let me talk about the digital revolution. There was a time when the introduction of the internet was a very disruptive force, internet and digital media, a very disruptive force for governments. And when it was first introduced, I think by now they're starting to, or they have been in the last 5 or 6 years, really adjusting to that and discovering ways of harnessing digital technologies in order to contain revolt. China is obviously on the forefront of those efforts, but Russia is also doing it, and a number of other countries are borrowing technologies from them. So digitalization it was disruptive in its ability to connect large numbers of people together through uncontrolled media information, uncensored media information. In the Middle East, it played a huge role. It's played a huge role in many other instances. But as I say, it does seem like the balance may be tilting backwards towards government in recent years in that interaction. However, one thing that social media do is that it makes it very difficult to they create a great variety of people. They help to create a great variety of people who connect to one another, usually over a particular issue. They may not share their values. In some ways, what it does is sort of bring people to the least common denominator of what and particularly what they mobilize against. So it feeds into some of the tendencies that these urban civic revolutions have had even before the rise of digital media. So they could mobilize large numbers of people, quite diverse, without sharing common values, and they also do it without leaders. So, you know, when the leadership of a revolt is some nebulous network of people, of bloggers and so on, you know, that makes for a very difficult situation in the aftermath of revolution. So it's just no political parties that are able to command popular support. It also makes it difficult for traditional politicians to control what crowds are doing, to be able to create some kind of strategy for a population in mobilization. So that becomes extremely difficult in the way that traditional social movement organization has been able to do. So less strategic mobilization on the part of populations. Often, you know, what has happened in a number of cases is that because traditional politicians have weak connections with crowds, they have difficult time containing violence within the crowd. So that's also been a factor. So in Ukraine and Euromaidan in 2014, the crowds were largely mobilized through digital media, and the traditional politicians couldn't contain, you know, the riotous aspects of the revolution. They tried, but they couldn't because they had no allegiance. They had no connections with the crowd that was mobilized. So there are all these ways in which digital media, I think, are profoundly affecting not just social movements, but also revolutions. In terms of a war of ideas, digital media make it actually somewhat difficult to have a war of ideas because they pull in so many different ideas into a single stream of mobilization. And so I don't think necessarily that revolution today is about a war of ideas. I think it's about people who are fed up. People who don't want to put up with their governments anymore. And so it pulls together these people in a kind of negative way, not in a positive way. And, you know, as the survey data that I showed indicated, certainly there wasn't a strong commitment to, you know, political values, democratic political values at least, within the crowds that made up those revolutions. There was a diversity of political values, a great diversity of political values. Doesn't mean that people were valueless. They had values, but it was just, you know, enormous diversity. So I think it's really hard to describe revolutions today as a war of ideas. That might have been the case at the time in the age of social revolutions, but not anymore.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Caris?
Yeah, thank you for the great answer, Professor. And I would like to ask just one follow-up questions. With the emergence of the digital world, do you think that the common forms of revolution or like the mass demonstration that we know right now will become outdated in an immediate time? Thank you.
That's a good question, because this urban civic model that I've kind of outlined, will it persist in the future? Will we still continue to rely on the power of numbers? I think there are a number of reasons why. Maybe there's reason to think that the urban civic model or the reliance on the power of numbers may decrease in the future. One is that governments are learning more effectively how to counter the power of numbers in certain ways. Digital communications, facial recognition systems, things like that are one aspect of it. Then they also are actually becoming slyer, more strategic in controlling space, the spatial control that keeps these movements on the periphery. And often now, at least in terms of revolutions, the targets of revolutions tend to be much more autocratic, much more repressive. And so they're able to survive these challenges a little bit better. So what we've seen in recent years is a decline in the success rate of these urban civic revolutions. They were once extraordinarily high, but they have become somewhat less successful more recently. And that may be a trend, in part because of the nature of the targets against which they're mobilizing and so on. But the demonstration, I think, is here to stay as a tool in some ways. It's not going to disappear entirely. What will happen is other things may come alongside of it. So as I indicated, a couple of minutes ago, revolutions are becoming a little bit more riotous today, somewhat more violent in terms of riots, alongside of huge demonstrations. So this kind of amalgamation and mixing of patterns, I think, is more likely. I don't think that demonstrations will disappear as a tool, not only a revolution, but also as a tool of social movements. And the concentration of people in the cities makes it all the more likely that it'll continue, but it may well, again, merge with other types of factors.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for the very impressive answer. Okay, I think it's already 1.5 hours. So if you allow us, Professor, maybe for the last question, yeah, to today discussion. After that, we can end the discussion. Okay, from Brilliant. Okay.
Okay, thank you for the chances. I think that when we're talking about urban, right, I imagine looking at city, and then I want to actually discuss as well. I think when we're talking about urban as well, we're talking about people. There's a melting point there. There's a different level of people, so that's why there's like a circulating idea overflowing, and that's what leads and pushes to revolutions in the urban for regime changes itself. But I still haven't got like the picturization of how urban look like, and like, is there a standard or parameter, like whether or not like this or a specific urban area should be like the perfect place for revolutions, or like maybe at least the government should separate the urban when we're talking about government center or government center area, and then separating from the business district. I think when we're talking about China, there's Beijing for the capital, so there's like government center. So when people do revolution, people just can protest in Beijing, so it won't actually disrupt, or like, let's say, not disturbing the economical or like social that usually in other area. Is it like that, or like, do you have any info that you can share?
Yeah, those are good questions. I have a chapter in the book that really talks about the spatial dimensions of cities and revolutions, how it plays into revolution or plays against revolution, sort of the role of urban design and so on. Attempts to move the capital away from and to create a new capital, as of course, has occurred in Myanmar, but in many other places, it's happening in Egypt. So regimes have different strategies, spatial strategies, in terms of trying to revolution-proof to their cities to prevent revolutions from occurring. So is a particular type of space better for revolution than another type of space? Well, concentrating large numbers of people can occur in a lot of different types of spaces. It can occur in sort of more linear types of spaces, or it can occur in very large sort of open spaces, the square. In fact, that I find doesn't really matter that much in terms of the outcomes of revolution. They can be successful either way. However, squares versus boulevards do make a difference in terms of the ways in which regimes and government and oppositions interact with one another. So the movement of people through boulevards can often be and has historically been a way to recruit people into a movement as you go along, but you also typically encounter government offices or opponents along the way, and it tends to be somewhat more violent than sort of gathering in a square, where the violence can come from police trying to clear the square, but is less a factor of the movement of people along and encountering government targets. So those sorts of spatial factors matter a lot in terms of interactions. Then the separation of business districts. Eric Hobsbawm actually wrote a relatively unknown essay, a short essay, on exactly this. And his argument was that the modern city tends to push people into, separates people from business areas, and therefore makes it a lot harder for revolutionaries to disrupt, which sounds a bit like what you were, raising the question about. However, I do think that people find ways to do it. They find the spaces to do it. Now, in the case of China, of course, they had enormous protests, in 1989, of up to 1 million people in Tiananmen. Tiananmen is a great space for mobilizing large numbers of people, which is why the government is very sensitive about it now, because it did happen. And another factor of Tiananmen was it has symbolic value. So the symbolic value of spaces also tends to multiply the number of people involved. And one of the things I show statistically in the book is that when an urban civic revolution mobilizes in a historically symbolic place, it tends to have larger numbers of people involved, and also tends to be more successful. So it can multiply the number of people and so on, and have those sorts of effects. So I think that these sort of factors of urban design make a big difference. Now, what happens when governments try to move their capitals away from urban centers where the large populations are? Well, Myanmar gives us a good example of that. By moving its capital 300 kilometers to the north into what was then jungle, and creating a whole new area. The purpose of that was to try to insulate civil servants from protests. But what happens ultimately is that populations over a period of time tend to concentrate even in those new capitals. They move to those new capitals. Politicians need to be entertained, they need to be fed, and civil servants too. And so the new capital in Myanmar grew at a fairly fast pace. And in the most recent unrest in Burma, in fact, they had significant protests there in Naypyidaw. So it's a strategy. Moving the capital is a strategy that buys a regime some time, but it's not a solution, to revolution-proofing your government. And I'm not sure even having a different location for the economy also. So I don't think that necessarily solves the problem.
Okay, I think that I kind of noticed a similar pattern when you're talking about Myanmar to Indonesia, when the government actually planning to move the capital somewhere up north. So hopefully there won't be any this kind of like actually not facing the problem itself. Yeah. And
Yeah,
I
I
think
mean,
that
so in Myanmar, in the 8888 uprising in 1988, you know, which occurred in Yangon largely, or happened in other places too, but in Yangon, the capital at that time, the civil servants were profoundly affected by it, and the army was profoundly affected by it, because they were getting pressured by their neighbors to participate, and that was the, you know, that was the rationale for moving the capital. So, but it doesn't work ultimately in the end. You know, as I said, it buys you time, but it's not a solution.
yeah, I think that's enough. Thank you for the response. Appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you, Brilliant, and thank you, Professor Beissinger. Okay, Professor, actually, there is one, I hope this is the the last question for you. Is it okay?
Sure.
After that we can, yeah, okay. Okay, thank you so much. Leonie?
Okay, yeah. I'm delighted to say that I did not expect to enjoy this book so much, and as it isn't my usual genre, this is the most comprehensive and significant quantitative study of revolutions in almost a century. The revolutionary city promises to be the definitive look at the most dominant form today, which is urban civic revolutions. Well, yeah, combining breadth, depth, and clarity, the revolutionary city tackles a complex question of enduring importance and examines it from a variety of angles, relying on multiple methods and successfully delivers important and original findings. So yeah, I definitely will suggest this book to other my fellow group peers, professors. So for the question is also, first thing first, I want to thank you for joining here with us to give the talk. We do really appreciate it. I'll try to be quick here. I'm wondering the extent to which your results about urbanization are also tied together with the development of economic structures across this time period. One thing particularly about urbanization is that sort of the early stages of capitalism, at least in the European cases, where in many cases brought together workers who were formerly disparate, now bringing them together into, dense living situation where they could be organized by a labor movement, social parties, versus the capitalism of today. And also the fact that the city of today, which is much more socially fragmented, as in which the kind of the dense class associated regions are not broken up things like the gentrification of urban centers for the fragmentation and the lack of kind of cohesive organizations in revolutions, which you discuss in urban areas today. And also one of the lesson to which this lack of organization might be tied to the inability of social movements to pursue non-revolutionary paths to achieving the same goals that they are thriving in through these revolutions. In other words, whether or not. Yeah, I'm wondering if the lack of sort of large encompassing social organizations makes non-revolutionary paths to changing things like corruptions less viable, and therefore increases the demand for revolution versus earlier time periods. Yeah, I think that's from me, Mr. Beissinger.
Okay, thank you. Those are great questions. I'm not sure I understood the last part of the last question, but we can come back to that. Let me answer the first part first, and then we'll come back. So, yeah, the pattern of early industrialization was to concentrate people, people from the countryside into these factory neighborhoods, and they were dense. They were not there were not broad boulevards or and squares and so on. They were ideal in some ways for armed insurrection. You know, what happened then in the second half of the 19th century and early 20th century was that the cities, these areas were moved out of the centers of cities, away from the immediate centers of power. And these large spaces were created, large boulevards for the movement of people, and large symbolic spaces, also for glorification of the state, often, and for educating the population in loyalty to the state. So these were created, and you had you know, concentration of peoples more on the periphery. So that fragmentation, you know, was a major part of, I think, the decline of social revolution in cities as well. In addition to, of course, the growing power of the state, as I described it. So that fragmentation is overcome, though, in the modern city through communication and transportation systems, which are able to gather large numbers of people in central spaces relatively quickly. So, but what it does is it changes the network structure of revolution. So whereas before they were dependent upon very localized sort of factory and neighborhood networks, today people do participate in revolution with friends and family, even today, and neighbors, and I show that. But they're these networks that are connecting people who participate in revolution are not necessarily locally based, not necessarily occupationally based, but still these strong ties, these friends and family are the basic units that participate in revolution. So I don't know if that answers the question, but the second question, why don't you repeat that so I can see if I can tackle that one?
Yeah, the second one is that I'm wondering if the lack sort of large encompassing social organizations makes non-revolutionary paths to changing things like corruptions less viable, and therefore increases the demand for revolution versus the earlier time periods.
Yeah, I'm not sure it makes it less viable, because I think the power of numbers can be used for reformist movements as well. So size actually matters, particularly in democracies. So democracies are much less vulnerable to revolutions, and I show that in the book, statistically, that they very rarely occur in democracies, and there's a good reason for that, because democracies are much more open to influence from society. For democracies are also, one of the key aspects of democracy, repeated elections, that breeds patience within a population. Why risk your life going out on the square in a revolution when you can wait 4 years for an election? Now, the big question facing democracies today, because we're witnessing around the world kind of the demeaning of democracy, what some have called de-democratization or democratic backsliding, is at what point these safeguards of democracy against revolution have deteriorated to the point that they no longer prevent people from wanting, engaging in revolutionary activity against, let's put it this way, that the system is no longer democratic in essence, right? That it's moved into something more like a competitive authoritarian system. So that is an issue that's plaguing a number of countries around the world, quite a number of countries. And we don't know the answer to that at this point in time, but I think it's one of the most important and interesting phenomena taking place.
Okay. How's Leonie? Is it clear enough?
Yeah, that's certainly clear enough to digest. Thank you, sir. I hope you're all safe and happy.
Thank you. Same to you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Beissinger. I think that's all Q&A sessions. Before we close the discussion, maybe would you like to deliver closing statement regarding the book discussion, Professor?
Well, I'll just say that I enjoyed your questions very much, and I was very happy to be able to speak with you today, and wish I could be there in person, but Zoom has its advantages too, because it allows us to connect very easily. And so thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to talk with you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor, for sharing your knowledge and your opinion regarding your latest book entitled The Revolutionary City, Urbanization and the Global Transformation. And okay, thanks also to Bapak Erlangga pribadi for giving a comment. And okay, stay healthy and see you in the next discussion. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. All the best to you.
Professor.
Thank you, Professor Beissinger.
Oke, terima kasih untuk teman-teman, terutama untuk kelas Gersos di sini. Karena ya saya bilangnya tadi akan ini kelas sebagai kelas mengganti ya untuk tanggal 27 April